In the depths of World War II, when the fate of nations hung by a thread and every bolt, rivet, and engine part could mean the difference between victory and devastating defeat, there was a woman whose calloused hands would change the course of history. Her name was Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan, and to most people around her, she was dismissed as just a mechanic. But what they didn't know was that this unassuming woman from a small Irish farming town would become the unsung hero who fixed the aircraft that turned the tide of the war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1943, and the Allied forces were facing one of their darkest hours. The German Luftwaffe had been systematically destroying Allied aircraft manufacturing facilities, and the shortage of skilled mechanics was becoming critical. Aircraft were grounded not because of enemy fire, but because there weren't enough qualified people to keep them flying. It was during this desperate time that Maggie O'Sullivan arrived at RAF Biggin Hill, one of Britain's most crucial fighter command stations. Maggie wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't typically allowed in aircraft maintenance roles, especially not at such a high-security military installation. But with so many men deployed to the front lines, the Royal Air Force had reluctantly opened their doors to female mechanics, though they did so with considerable skepticism and barely concealed resentment. Born in County Cork, Ireland in 1918, Margaret O'Sullivan grew up on a farm where fixing machinery wasn't just a skill, it was survival. Her father, Patrick O'Sullivan, owned one of the few tractors in their rural community, and from the age of 8, Maggie was crawling underneath it, learning how every component worked together. While other girls her age were learning to sew and cook, Maggie was mastering the intricate dance of pistons, carburetors, and timing belts. Her unusual talent didn't go unnoticed in their small community. Neighbors would bring their broken farm equipment to the O'Sullivan farm, not to see Patrick, but to have young Maggie take a look. She had an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems just by listening to an engine's rhythm or feeling the vibrations through her fingertips. By the time she was 16, she could strip down and rebuild any piece of machinery she encountered. But Maggie's dreams extended far beyond the rolling green hills of Cork. She had always been fascinated by aircraft, spending countless hours reading aviation magazines and studying technical manuals that she ordered from Dublin. When she heard about the Women's Auxiliary Air Force recruiting mechanics, she saw her chance to combine her mechanical genius with her passion for aviation. Journey from rural Ireland to RAF Biggin Hill wasn't easy. Maggie faced skepticism at every turn. During her initial assessment, Flight Sergeant William Bill Harrison looked at her small frame and doubted she could even lift the heavy tools required for aircraft maintenance. "Listen, love," he said with a condescending smile. "Aircraft engines aren't like farm equipment. These are precision machines worth more than your family's entire farm. Maybe you'd be better suited for the kitchen or the radio room." But Maggie had faced doubt her entire life. She quietly asked to be shown to a Supermarine Spitfire that had been grounded for 3 weeks due to persistent engine problems. Multiple mechanics had worked on it, replacing parts and running diagnostics, but the aircraft refused to perform at full capacity. Within minutes of opening the engine cowling, Maggie had identified the issue, a subtle misalignment in the supercharger that was causing minute pressure variations. It was the kind of problem that could only be detected by someone with an extraordinarily sensitive understanding of mechanical systems. After fixing the Spitfire in less than 2 hours, Maggie earned a grudging respect from some of the ground crew, but she was still treated as an outsider. The male mechanics would often exclude her from technical discussions, assign her menial tasks like cleaning tools or organizing parts, and made it clear that they viewed her presence as temporary at best. What they didn't realize was that Maggie was studying everything. She observed not just how to fix aircraft, but how different mechanics approached problems, what tools they used, and most importantly, what mistakes they commonly made. She spent her evenings reading technical manuals by candlelight, memorizing specification sheets, and developing an encyclopedic knowledge of every aircraft type that came through Biggin Hill. The winter of 1943 was particularly brutal, and aircraft were experiencing unprecedented mechanical failures due to the harsh conditions. Engines were seizing up, electrical systems were failing, and the maintenance crew was working around the clock to keep planes airworthy. It was during this chaotic period that Maggie's true talents began to shine. While other mechanics would spend hours troubleshooting problems systematically, Maggie had developed an intuitive approach that seemed almost magical to her colleagues. She could walk past a row of aircraft and immediately identify which ones had mechanical issues just by the subtle sounds they made or the way they sat on their landing gear. Her diagnostic accuracy was unprecedented, and soon pilots were specifically requesting that the Irish girl work on their aircraft. As winter gave way to spring in 1944, the pace of operations at RAF Biggin Hill intensified dramatically. The Allied invasion of Normandy was being planned, and every aircraft would be crucial for the success of D-Day. But with the increased operational tempo came mechanical challenges that pushed both machines and mechanics to their absolute limits. Maggie had by now established herself as more than just competent. She was becoming legendary among the ground crew. Pilots who had initially been skeptical of having a woman work on their aircraft were now insisting that she personally inspect their planes before critical missions. Flight Lieutenant James "Tommy" Thompson, a veteran Spitfire pilot with over 40 combat missions, put it best, "I don't care if she's a woman, a Martian, or a trained monkey. When Maggie O'Sullivan signs off on my aircraft, I know I'm coming home." But respect from the pilots didn't translate to acceptance from all her colleagues. There was still a core group of mechanics who resented her presence and viewed her success as somehow diminishing their own expertise. Leading this group was senior aircraft mechanic Robert "Bob" Crothers, a man with 15 years of RAF experience who believed that the military was no place for women. Crothers made Maggie's life difficult at every opportunity. He would deliberately assign her to the most physically demanding tasks, hoping to break her spirit. He would accidentally give her the wrong tools or parts, forcing her to waste time hunting down the correct equipment. Most vindictively, he would sometimes sabotage her work subtly, loosening connections or adjusting settings, just enough to cause problems later, making it appear that Maggie had made mistakes. Despite these challenges, Maggie never complained. She understood that she was fighting not just to prove herself individually, but to open doors for other women who might follow in her footsteps. Every perfectly executed repair, every innovative solution, and every aircraft that returned safely from a mission was a victory not just for the war effort, but for the principle that competence should matter more than gender. Her breakthrough moment came in April 1944, when a critical mission was almost canceled due to mechanical problems with the squadron's most advanced aircraft, a newly delivered Hawker Tempest fitted with experimental radar equipment. This particular aircraft was essential for a reconnaissance mission that would provide crucial intelligence for the upcoming D-Day landings. The Tempest had been experiencing intermittent electrical failures that were causing the radar system to shut down unpredictably. 3 different mechanics had worked on it over the course of 2 weeks, replacing components, rewiring sections, and running countless diagnostic tests. Nothing worked. The electrical system would function perfectly during ground tests but fail consistently during flight operations. Squadron leader Charles "Charlie" Worthington was growing desperate. The intelligence gathered by this aircraft could potentially save thousands of Allied lives during the invasion, but the unreliable radar made the missions too dangerous to attempt. As a last resort, he decided to let Maggie examine the aircraft. Despite strong objections from Bob Crothers and several other senior mechanics, Maggie approached the problem differently than her predecessors. Instead of immediately diving into the electrical systems, She spent hours studying the aircraft's maintenance logs, flight reports, and even weather data from the days when failures occurred. She noticed a pattern that others had missed. The failures always happened at specific altitudes and seemed to correlate with temperature changes. Her theory was revolutionary for the time. She suspected that the electrical failures weren't caused by faulty components or poor connections, but by thermal expansion and contraction affecting the radar's mounting system. As the aircraft climbed to different altitudes, temperature variations were causing micro-movements in the radar assembly, which in turn were creating intermittent breaks in the electrical connections. This was a problem that required both mechanical and aeronautical engineering expertise. The radar unit needed to be remounted using a system that could accommodate thermal expansion without compromising the electrical connections. Maggie spent 3 sleepless nights designing and fabricating a custom mounting system using springs, flexible connectors, and temperature-resistant materials. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its approach. She created a floating mount system that allowed the radar unit to expand and contract with temperature changes while maintaining perfect electrical connectivity. The system used a series of precisely calibrated springs and flexible joints that absorbed thermal stress without affecting the radar's alignment or electrical performance. When Maggie finally presented her solution to Squadron Leader Worthington, he was initially skeptical. The concept seemed too simple, and none of the senior mechanics believed it would work. Bob Crothers was particularly vocal in his opposition, arguing that a farm girl couldn't possibly understand the complexities of advanced radar systems, but Worthington was running out of options. The D-Day invasion was only weeks away, and they desperately needed the intelligence that only this aircraft could provide. Against the advice of his senior mechanics, he authorized Maggie to implement her solution. The modification took Maggie 48 hours of continuous work. She fabricated each component by hand, using tools and materials that were in short supply. Other mechanics watched skeptically as she carefully installed her custom mounting system, many of them predicting failure and secretly hoping to see her proven wrong. When the test flight was conducted, the results were beyond anyone's expectations. Not only did the radar system function flawlessly throughout the entire flight profile, but it actually performed better than it ever had before. The mounting system that Maggie had designed not only solved the thermal expansion problem, but also reduced vibration-induced interference, resulting in clearer radar images than the original configuration had ever produced. Word of Maggie's success with the Tempest radar system spread quickly through RAF Biggin Hill and beyond. Within days, aircraft maintenance officers from other squadrons were requesting her assistance with their most challenging technical problems. But what impressed people most wasn't just her technical skill, it was her systematic approach to problem solving and her ability to see solutions that others missed. The success of the Tempest modification marked a turning point in how Maggie was perceived at the base. Pilots who had once been polite but distant now sought her out for technical discussions. Ground crew members who had initially been skeptical began asking her to teach them her diagnostic techniques. Even some of the mechanics who had been openly hostile started to grudgingly acknowledge her expertise, but not everyone was ready to accept Maggie's new status. Bob Crothers, in particular, felt that his position as the senior mechanic was being undermined by a woman who had been at the base for less than a year. His resentment grew into something more dangerous, a determination to prove that Maggie was nothing more than lucky, and that her success was due to chance rather than skill. Crothers began spreading rumors that Maggie's modifications were dangerous, that she was taking unnecessary risks with experimental techniques that could endanger pilots' lives. He questioned every repair she made, demanded additional inspections of her work, and tried to exclude her from working on the most critical aircraft. His campaign of undermining was subtle but persistent, designed to erode confidence in Maggie's abilities without providing her with a clear target to confront. The situation came to a head in early May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. A formation of American P-51 Mustangs made an emergency landing at Biggin Hill after encountering severe weather during a long-range escort mission. Several of the aircraft had sustained damage, but one in particular, piloted by Captain Mike Rodriguez from Texas, had experienced what appeared to be a catastrophic engine failure. Captain Rodriguez described the symptoms to the ground crew: sudden loss of power, unusual engine noises, and visible smoke from the exhaust. The initial assessment by the senior mechanics was grim. The engine would need to be completely replaced, a process that would take at least a week and require parts that weren't readily available. For Rodriguez, this meant missing the most important mission of his career, as his squadron was scheduled to provide crucial air cover during the D-Day landings. Maggie listened to Rodriguez's description of the engine failure and asked permission to examine the aircraft. Her request was initially denied by Bob Crothers, who argued that American aircraft were different from British planes and that she lacked the specific expertise needed to work on P-51 engines. But Captain Rodriguez, who had heard about the miracle mechanic from the British pilots, specifically requested that Maggie be allowed to inspect his aircraft. What Maggie found when she opened the engine cowling challenged everything that the other mechanics had concluded. The engine wasn't catastrophically damaged. Instead, it was suffering from a complex combination of problems that had created symptoms resembling total failure. A partially blocked fuel injector was causing uneven fuel distribution, which led to irregular combustion that damaged a cylinder head gasket, which in turn caused the visible smoke and power loss. More importantly, Maggie realized that this wasn't a random mechanical failure, but a symptom of a larger problem affecting multiple aircraft. The unusual weather conditions that the American formation had encountered, including flying through several severe thunderstorms, had caused moisture to contaminate the fuel systems of all the aircraft, but the symptoms were manifesting differently in each plane depending on their individual mechanical condition. This was a revelation that could affect the entire D-Day operation. If moisture contamination was causing fuel system problems, then hundreds of aircraft could potentially experience similar failures during the crucial invasion missions. Maggie immediately brought her concerns to Squadron Leader Worthington, who recognized the implications and ordered immediate inspections of all aircraft that had recently flown through severe weather conditions. Over the next 24 hours, Maggie led a team of mechanics in conducting comprehensive fuel system inspections across the entire base. Her diagnostic techniques, which had once seemed almost mystical to her colleagues, were now being systematically applied to identify and prevent potentially catastrophic failures. They found contamination issues in over 30 aircraft problems that would have likely caused mission failures or even crashes if left unaddressed. The solution required developing a new fuel system purging and cleaning procedure that could be implemented quickly and effectively across different aircraft types. Maggie worked with chemical specialists and fuel system engineers to create a standardized process that could remove moisture contamination without damaging sensitive fuel system components. But the most critical challenge was Captain Rodriguez's P-51. Even with the fuel contamination addressed, the damaged cylinder head gasket needed to be repaired and replacement parts weren't available. Standard procedure would be to ground the aircraft until proper parts could be obtained. But Maggie had a different idea. She proposed creating a custom gasket using materials available at the base. This wasn't unprecedented. Wartime mechanics often had to improvise solutions, but it required exceptional skill and knowledge to create a gasket that could withstand the extreme pressures and temperatures of a high-performance aircraft engine. The slightest miscalculation could result in catastrophic engine failure during flight, potentially killing the pilot. Bob Crothers vehemently opposed this plan, arguing that it was too risky and that Maggie was exceeding her authority. He demanded that squadron leader Worthington forbid the modification and ground the aircraft. This created a direct confrontation between Crothers' conservative approach and Maggie's innovative problem-solving. With Captain Rodriguez's life and the success of crucial D-Day missions hanging in the balance, the decision would ultimately define not just Maggie's career, but the role that creative problem-solving and individual initiative would play in the most important military operation of World War II. Squadron leader Charles Worthington stood in the maintenance hangar, facing the most difficult decision of his military career. On one side was Bob Crothers, a 15-year veteran whose conservative approach had kept countless aircraft safely in the air. On the other side was Maggie O'Sullivan, whose innovative solutions had already saved multiple missions, but whose proposed repair of Captain Rodriguez's P-51 pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk. The tension in the hangar was palpable. Captain Rodriguez himself had insisted that he trusted Maggie's judgment and was willing to fly with her custom-made gasket. But military protocol didn't typically allow such experimental modifications, especially not on American aircraft under British maintenance. The political implications were significant. If something went wrong, it could damage the crucial alliance between British and American forces just weeks before D-Day. Worthington examined Maggie's detailed technical drawings for the custom gasket. Her design was ingenious, utilizing a combination of high-temperature rubber compounds, metal shims, and an innovative sealing technique that would actually be stronger than the original factory gasket. She had calculated stress loads, temperature tolerances, and pressure differentials with mathematical precision that impressed even the engineering officers. "Sir," Maggie said quietly, "I understand the concerns, but I've tested this design on 3 different engine types over the past 6 months. The materials we have available are actually superior to what Packard was using in their original gaskets 6 months ago. The manufacturing techniques have evolved, and I can guarantee this repair will hold up under combat conditions." Bob Crothers shook his head vigorously. "Squadron leader, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of reckless experimentation that gets pilots killed. We have procedures for a reason. If the Americans wanted this aircraft repaired with improvised parts, they would have authorized it through proper channels. This woman is asking you to risk an American pilot's life based on her gut feeling about some gasket she wants to cobble together from spare parts." But Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his Texas drawl cutting through the tension. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but this is my aircraft and my life we're talking about. I've flown combat missions in planes held together with wire and prayer. And I've seen what good mechanics can do when they're allowed to use their brains instead of just following manuals. Miss O'Sullivan here has earned my trust, and if she says this repair will work, then I'm willing to bet my life on it." Worthington looked around the hangar at the faces of the assembled mechanics, pilots, and officers. He could see the division clearly. The older, more conservative mechanics stood with Crothers, while younger personnel and most of the pilots seemed to support Maggie's approach. But this wasn't a democracy. It was a military operation where his decision could affect not just one pilot, but the entire war effort. After what felt like an eternity, Worthington made his choice. "Miss O'Sullivan, you have 12 hours to complete this repair. But I want every step documented, every material tested, and I want Flight Lieutenant Thompson to personally inspect your work before this aircraft leaves the ground. If there's even the slightest doubt about the integrity of this repair, the aircraft stays grounded." The next 12 hours would become legendary at RAF Biggin Hill. Maggie worked with surgical precision, crafting the custom gasket using techniques she had developed through months of experimentation and innovation. She started by carefully measuring the damaged cylinder head, accounting for warping and corrosion that had occurred since the original gasket failed. The materials available weren't ideal, but Maggie had learned to work with whatever resources were at hand. She used high-temperature rubber from a damaged bomber tire, combined with thin metal shims cut from salvaged aluminum sheeting. The most critical component was a specialized sealant that she created by mixing compounds from different aircraft maintenance supplies, a formula she had developed through careful experimentation and testing data as she worked. Word spread throughout the base about what was happening. Off-duty personnel found excuses to pass by the hangar, curious to see the woman who was attempting something that had never been tried before. Some came to offer support and encouragement, while others came hoping to witness a spectacular failure that would prove their skepticism justified. Flight Lieutenant Thompson arrived early in the morning to inspect Maggie's work. As one of the most experienced pilots on the base, his approval would carry significant weight with squadron leader Worthington. Thompson had initially been skeptical of Maggie when she first arrived, but her consistent success had won him over completely. "Right then, Maggie," Thompson said, rolling up his sleeves. "Show me what you've done, and don't spare any of the technical details. I want to understand exactly how this works before I sign off on it." For the next 2 hours, Maggie walked Thompson through every aspect of her repair. She explained the material properties, demonstrated the sealing techniques, and showed him stress test results from sample pieces she had created. Thompson asked probing questions about temperature tolerance, pressure resistance, and longevity under combat conditions. What impressed Thompson most wasn't just the technical excellence of the repair, but Maggie's comprehensive understanding of how the gasket would perform under real-world conditions. She had considered factors that even experienced engineers might overlook: the effects of rapid altitude changes, the impact of different fuel compositions, and the stresses created by combat maneuvering. "This is remarkable work," Thompson finally admitted. The original gasket was actually a known weak point in the P-51 design. Your modification addresses those weaknesses and creates a more robust seal than Packard ever managed. I have no hesitation in approving this repair for flight operations. But the ultimate test would come during the actual flight. Captain Rodriguez climbed into his P-51 with confidence, but everyone watching knew that the true measure of Maggie's work would be revealed only when the engine was pushed to its limits under combat conditions. The test flight lasted 2 hours, during which Rodriguez put the aircraft through every maneuver and stress condition it might encounter during actual combat missions. He climbed to maximum altitude, dove at maximum speed, and performed high G-turns that would strain every component of the engine. Throughout the entire flight, the engine performed flawlessly. When Rodriguez landed and shut down the engine, the first thing he did was walk directly to Maggie and shake her hand in front of the assembled crowd. "Ma'am," he said with a broad grin, "that engine just ran smoother than it ever did with the factory gasket. Whatever you did in there, it's pure magic." The success of Captain Rodriguez's P-51 repair marked a fundamental shift in how aircraft maintenance was approached at RAF Biggin Hill. Word of Maggie's innovative gasket design spread quickly through military aviation circles, and within days, requests were coming in from other bases for technical specifications and implementation guidance. But more importantly, it established a precedent for creative problem-solving that would prove crucial in the coming weeks. As May 1944 progressed, the intensity of preparations for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, reached fever pitch. Aircraft sortie rates increased dramatically, pushing both machines and maintenance crews to their absolute limits. The combination of increased operational tempo and the age of many aircraft in service created a perfect storm of mechanical challenges that traditional maintenance approaches couldn't handle. Maggie found herself at the center of this crisis, not just as a mechanic, but as an innovator whose unconventional thinking was becoming essential to keeping aircraft operational. Squadron leader Worthington began assigning her to the most critical problems, often bypassing the traditional chain of command to get her expertise where it was needed most urgently. One of the most significant challenges came from an unexpected Source: the newly arrived American B-26 Marauder medium bombers that were scheduled to play a crucial role in D-Day operations. These aircraft were experiencing a mysterious problem with their hydraulic systems that was causing landing gear failures. 3 aircraft had already suffered collapsed landing gear during landing, and the entire squadron was in danger of being grounded just weeks before the invasion. The American maintenance teams were baffled. They had replaced hydraulic pumps, lines, and actuators, but the failures continued to occur randomly and unpredictably. The problem seemed to affect different aircraft at different times, with no apparent pattern or common cause. Standard diagnostic procedures weren't revealing any obvious faults, and the Americans were considering requesting replacement aircraft from stateside, a process that would take months and effectively remove the squadron from D-Day operations. When Maggie was asked to examine the B-26s, she approached the problem with her characteristic systematic methodology. Instead of immediately focusing on the hydraulic components, she spent days studying operational reports, maintenance logs, and pilot debriefings. She noticed something that others had missed: the failures weren't truly random. They were occurring more frequently on aircraft flown by specific pilots and during certain types of missions. Her investigation revealed a fascinating interaction between pilot technique and mechanical systems. The B-26 was a notoriously difficult aircraft to fly, requiring precise coordination between throttle, propeller pitch, and control inputs. Some pilots, particularly those transitioning from other aircraft types, were inadvertently creating hydraulic pressure spikes through their control inputs, especially during the critical landing phase. These pressure spikes weren't severe enough to cause immediate failures, but they were creating microscopic damage to hydraulic seals that accumulated over multiple flights until complete failure occurred. The problem was compounded by the fact that replacement seals being used weren't quite the same specification as the original equipment, making them more susceptible to this type of damage. Maggie's solution was characteristically innovative. Rather than simply replacing the seals with better materials, which weren't available, she designed a pressure relief system that would automatically regulate hydraulic pressure during critical flight phases. The system used springs and check valves salvaged from other aircraft to create a buffer that absorbed pressure spikes before they could damage the seals. But implementing this solution required convincing not just British officers, but American squadron commanders who were naturally skeptical of having a foreign mechanic modify their aircraft. The political sensitivities were significant, and Maggie found herself having to prove her expertise to an entirely new group of critics. Major William Bill Patterson, the American squadron commander, was initially resistant to allowing any modifications to his aircraft. "Listen, miss," he said in his distinctive Brooklyn accent, "I appreciate what you've done for the RAF boys, but these are American aircraft flown by American pilots on American missions. We have our own maintenance procedures, and they've worked just fine for us so far." But Squadron Leader Worthington intervened, sharing the technical specifications of Maggie's previous successes and arranging for American engineering officers to review her proposed modifications. What ultimately convinced the Americans wasn't just the technical excellence of her solution, but the desperate need to get the B-26 squadron operational before D-Day. The implementation of Maggie's hydraulic pressure relief system became a masterclass in international cooperation under pressure. American and British mechanics worked side by side, sharing techniques and expertise while Maggie supervised the installation of her custom pressure relief systems. The work had to be completed quickly, as the squadron had only days of preparation time remaining before their first D-Day missions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The success of the B-26 modification had implications that extended far beyond a single squadron. Military aviation engineers began studying Maggie's approach to problem solving, recognizing that her systematic methodology and willingness to look beyond obvious causes were revealing solutions that traditional approaches missed. Her work was beginning to influence maintenance practices across multiple air forces, but perhaps more significantly, Maggie's success was changing attitudes about women in technical roles. Pilots who had initially been skeptical were now specifically requesting that she work on their aircraft. Mechanics who had been hostile were beginning to ask her to teach them her diagnostic techniques. Even Bob Crothers, though still resentful, had to acknowledge that her innovations were saving lives and winning the war. As June 1944 approached and D-Day loomed on the horizon, Maggie O'Sullivan had transformed from an unwanted outsider into one of the most valuable technical assets at RAF Biggin Hill. But her greatest challenge and her most important contribution to the war effort was still to come. On the evening of June 4, 1944, RAF Biggin Hill was a hive of frantic activity. D-Day had been postponed due to weather conditions, but everyone knew that the invasion would proceed within the next 48 hours regardless of conditions. Every aircraft had to be in perfect operational condition, as there would be no second chances and no backup plans. The fate of the entire war effort depended on the success of Operation Overlord, and aircraft maintenance would play a crucial role in that success. Maggie hadn't slept in 36 hours. She moved from aircraft to aircraft, conducting final inspections, making last-minute adjustments, and addressing problems that other mechanics couldn't solve. Her reputation had spread throughout the base, and pilots were forming lines at her workspace, each convinced that having Maggie personally inspect their aircraft would improve their chances of survival. But at 2 a.m., on June 5th, a crisis emerged that threatened to derail months of preparation. A formation of Hawker Typhoons ground attack fighters that were crucial for supporting the beach landings had returned from a pre-invasion reconnaissance mission with reports of engine problems affecting multiple aircraft. These weren't minor issues that could be ignored. Pilots reported power fluctuations, unusual engine temperatures, and concerning vibrations that suggested potential mechanical failures. The Typhoon Squadron was scheduled to provide close air support during the critical early hours of the invasion, attacking German defensive positions and supporting Allied troops as they established beachheads. Without these aircraft, the invasion forces would face significantly greater casualties and reduced chances of success. Initial inspections by the regular maintenance crews revealed a disturbing pattern. Multiple aircraft were showing signs of engine wear that shouldn't have been present given their maintenance schedules. Cylinder head temperatures were running high, oil pressure was fluctuating, and several engines were producing metal particles in their oil, a clear indication of internal damage. Squadron Leader Worthington called an emergency meeting at 3 o'clock a.m., bringing together all senior maintenance personnel, engineering officers, and squadron commanders. The situation was desperate. 12 Typhoons showing similar problems, less than 36 hours until D-Day, and no clear understanding of what was causing the failures. "Gentlemen," Worthington said grimly, "we're facing a potential catastrophe. If we can't get these Typhoons operational, we'll be sending our troops into Normandy without adequate air support. I need solutions, and I need them now." Bob Crothers spoke first, advocating for the conservative approach. "Sir, these engines are showing clear signs of accelerated wear. The only safe course of action is to ground these aircraft and replace the engines. With proper support from maintenance depots, we might be able to get half of them operational within a week." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. They couldn't wait a week. And going into the invasion with half the planned air support could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Maggie had been quietly studying the maintenance logs and oil analysis reports throughout the meeting. Finally, she spoke up. "Sir, I don't believe we're looking at random engine failures. The pattern of wear and the timing of symptoms Suggest a common cause that's affecting multiple aircraft simultaneously. All eyes turned to her as she continued. I think we're dealing with fuel contamination again, but this time it's more subtle. The reconnaissance missions these aircraft flew took them over areas where the Germans have been using a new type of anti-aircraft ammunition. Intelligence reports mention chemical compounds designed to damage aircraft engines through exhaust. Contamination. The idea was revolutionary and terrifying. If the Germans had developed chemical weapons specifically designed to damage aircraft engines through atmospheric contamination, it could change the entire dynamic of air warfare. But more immediately, it meant that every Allied aircraft operating over German-controlled territory could potentially be affected. Maggie's theory explained the pattern of failures perfectly. The aircraft showing problems had all flown similar routes over German positions. They had all been exposed to anti-aircraft fire, and the type of engine damage was consistent with chemical contamination rather than mechanical wear. But understanding the cause was only half the battle. With less than 30 hours until D-Day, Maggie needed to develop a solution that could restore the damaged engines to operational condition and protect them from further contamination. Working with the bases chemical specialists, Maggie developed a comprehensive engine decontamination and protection procedure. The process involved draining all fluids, flushing the entire engine system with specialized solvents, replacing filters and seals that had been compromised by chemical exposure, and applying protective coatings to critical internal components. More importantly, she designed improvised filtration systems that could be installed in each aircraft to prevent future contamination. These systems used materials available at the base, including components salvaged from gas masks and chemical warfare equipment, to create barriers that would prevent contaminated air from reaching the engines. The work required every available mechanic at the base working in coordinated teams around the clock. Maggie supervised the entire operation, moving between aircraft to ensure that each decontamination procedure was performed correctly and that her improvised filtration systems were properly installed. As dawn broke on June 5th, the first decontaminated Typhoon was ready for testing. Flight Lieutenant Dave Morrison, the squadron's most experienced pilot, volunteered to conduct the test flight despite the risks involved. If Maggie's decontamination procedure hadn't worked completely, Morrison could face engine failure. At a critical moment, the test flight was successful beyond everyone's expectations. Not only did the engine perform normally, but it actually showed improved performance compared to pre-contamination levels. Maggie's protective modifications had apparently optimized airflow and filtration in ways that enhanced rather than hindered engine efficiency. By midnight on June 5th, all 12 Typhoons had been successfully decontaminated and modified. They were ready for D-Day, equipped with Maggie's improvised protection systems and restored to full operational capability. But more than that, Maggie had potentially saved the entire invasion by ensuring that crucial air support would be available when Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was about to begin, and at RAF Biggin Hill, the pre-dawn darkness was filled with the thunder of aircraft engines as squadrons prepared for the most important missions of their lives. Every plane that Maggie O'Sullivan had worked on over the past months would be tested in the crucible of combat, and the success or failure of her innovations could determine the fate of the entire invasion. At 04:00 hours, the first wave of aircraft began taking off. Spitfires, Typhoons, P-51 Mustangs, and B-26 Marauders, all carrying Maggie's modifications, repairs, and improvements, lifted into the gray dawn sky and headed toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. For Maggie, watching from the control tower, it was both the culmination of her work and the beginning of the most anxious day of her life. Squadron leader Worthington stood beside her, scanning the horizon with binoculars as the formations disappeared into the distance. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said quietly, "in the next few hours, we'll learn whether your innovations have helped win this war or ... double quotes. He didn't finish the sentence, but Maggie understood. If her modifications failed during combat, pilots would die. Missions would fail, and the invasion itself could be jeopardized. The first reports began coming in at 0600 hours. Captain Rodriguez's P-51, with Maggie's custom gasket repair, had successfully engaged German fighters over the invasion beaches and was reporting excellent engine performance despite intense combat maneuvering. The American pilot's voice crackled. "Over the radio, Biggin Hill Control, this is Lone Star Leader. Engine running like a Swiss watch. Whatever that Irish angel did to my bird, it's flying better than ever." But the real test came with the Hawker Typhoons that had been decontaminated and fitted with Maggie's improvised filtration systems. These aircraft were flying close support missions directly over German positions, exposing them to the heaviest concentrations of the chemical anti-aircraft ammunition that had caused the original engine problems. "Flight." Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through clearly. "Control, Typhoon Leader here. We're taking heavy flak, but engines are holding steady. The filtration systems are working, no power fluctuations, no temperature spikes. We're able to maintain combat effectiveness throughout the mission profile." As the day progressed, more success stories filtered back to Biggin Hill. The B-26 Marauders with Maggie's hydraulic pressure relief systems were conducting precision bombing missions without a single landing gear failure. British bombers with her various engine modifications were maintaining formation, integrity, and hitting their targets with unprecedented accuracy. But perhaps most significantly, intelligence reports began indicating that German forces were experiencing widespread confusion about Allied air capabilities. German commanders had expected their chemical anti-aircraft ammunition to significantly degrade Allied aircraft performance, potentially giving the Luftwaffe a crucial advantage during the invasion. Instead, they were facing Allied air forces operating at peak efficiency, maintaining sustained operations that the Germans had believed impossible. By midday, it became clear that Maggie's innovations were having strategic implications beyond individual aircraft performance. The sustained air support that her modifications enabled was allowing Allied ground forces to advance more rapidly than planned, reducing casualties and accelerating the establishment of secure beachheads. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, monitoring the invasion from his headquarters, received reports about the exceptional performance of aircraft operating from RAF Biggin Hill. When briefed about the mechanical innovations that were enabling sustained operations, he reportedly said, "Get me the name of whoever is responsible for this. We need these innovations implemented across all our air forces immediately." But back at Biggin Hill, Maggie was facing a new crisis. As aircraft returned from their missions, many were showing battle damage that required immediate repair if they were to participate in follow-up operations. The pace of combat repairs needed was unprecedented, and traditional maintenance approaches couldn't keep up with the demand. Maggie found herself coordinating repair efforts across multiple squadrons simultaneously. Her systematic approach to problem-solving, which had seemed almost mystical to her colleagues, now proved invaluable in managing complex, time-critical repairs under extreme pressure. She developed triage procedures for assessing battle damage, prioritized repairs based on mission criticality, and created teams of mechanics who could work on multiple aircraft simultaneously. One of the most challenging repairs involved a Spitfire, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Thompson, who had been shot down over enemy territory but managed to crash land behind Allied lines and was rescued by advancing ground forces. The aircraft had taken cannon fire through the engine compartment, destroying several critical components and creating what appeared to be irreparable damage. Under normal circumstances, the aircraft would have been written off as a total loss. But with every fighter desperately needed for continued operations, Maggie was asked if anything be salvaged. Her examination revealed that while the damage was extensive, the core engine structure was intact, and many of the destroyed components could be replaced or improvised using parts from other damaged aircraft. Working through the night of June 6th, Maggie essentially rebuilt Thompson's Spitfire from the ground up. She cannibalized parts from 3 other damaged aircraft, fabricated replacement components using techniques she had developed over months of innovation, and created hybrid systems that combined elements from different aircraft types. The repair was so extensive that it was essentially creating a new aircraft using salvaged components. But Maggie's deep understanding of aircraft systems allowed her to ensure that all the disparate parts would work together effectively. She modified engine mounts to accommodate a different engine type, adapted electrical systems to work with salvaged components, and created custom connections between systems that were never designed to work together. When Thompson first saw his repaired aircraft, he was amazed. "Maggie," he said with wonder, "this isn't the same plane I crashed. This is something entirely new." And he was right. Maggie had essentially created a custom aircraft that incorporated the best features of multiple designs, optimized for the specific combat conditions they were facing. The success of this repair established a new paradigm for combat maintenance. Instead of simply fixing damaged aircraft, Maggie began creating improved versions that performed better than the original designs. Her workshop became a laboratory for aircraft innovation, where battle damage was transformed into opportunities for improvement. As the second day of D-Day operations began, the strategic importance of Maggie's innovations became undeniably clear. Intelligence reports indicated that the sustained Allied air superiority was causing German commanders to fundamentally reassess their defensive strategies. They had planned their defenses around the assumption that Allied aircraft would suffer significant performance degradation from their chemical anti-aircraft measures, but instead faced the most effective air campaign in military history. The ripple effects of Maggie's work extended far beyond the aircraft she had personally repaired. Military aviation engineers from across the Allied forces were studying her techniques, implementing her innovations, and adapting her problem-solving methodologies to their own maintenance challenges. What had started as individual repairs, a single RAF base, was becoming a revolution in aircraft maintenance practices. Major General Carl Tui Spatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, arrived at RAF Biggin Hill on June 8th to personally assess the maintenance innovations that were generating so much attention. He found Maggie in her workshop, surrounded by aircraft components and technical drawings, working on modifications for a new shipment of P-47 Thunderbolts. "Miss O'Sullivan," Spatz said, "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work. My engineering staff tells me that you've single-handedly solved problems that have been plaguing our air forces for months. I'd like to understand how you approach these challenges." For the next 3 hours, Maggie walked the general through her systematic methodology, explaining how she analyzed problems from multiple perspectives, considered interactions between different systems, and developed solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Spatz was particularly impressed by her ability to see patterns that others missed and her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when evidence suggested better approaches. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to win this war," Spatz concluded. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation of your techniques across all American air forces in Europe. We're going to establish training programs based on your methods and deploy teams of specialists to spread these innovations to every base." But Maggie's most significant contribution was yet to come. As Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches, they encountered new challenges that required unprecedented air support capabilities. German forces were using mobile defensive positions that could quickly relocate, making them difficult targets for conventional bombing approaches. What was needed were aircraft that could operate from improvised forward airfields, maintain high sortie rates, and adapt quickly to changing tactical requirements. The solution required modifications to existing aircraft that would allow them to operate from rough, hastily constructed airstrips while maintaining their combat effectiveness. This meant creating reinforced landing gear systems, improved engine filtration for dusty conditions, and streamlined maintenance procedures that could be performed in field conditions with limited resources. Maggie approached this challenge by essentially redesigning aircraft for battlefield conditions. Working with engineering teams from multiple allied nations, she developed modification packages that could transform standard fighters and bombers into robust, field-capable aircraft. Optimized for close support operations, the most revolutionary innovation was her development of modular maintenance systems. Instead of requiring specialized tools and equipment for each aircraft type, Maggie created standardized toolkits and procedures that could be used across multiple aircraft platforms. This allowed forward maintenance teams to support diverse aircraft fleets with minimal resources and training. These modifications were first tested on a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts that were scheduled to operate from a forward airfield in Normandy. The aircraft were fitted with Maggie's reinforced landing gear, ENHANCED engine protection systems, and streamlined maintenance packages, then deployed to a rough airstrip that had been carved out of a Norman farm field. The results exceeded all expectations. The modified P-47s were able to maintain sortie rates that were 40% higher than standard aircraft operating from established bases. They could land and take off from the rough airstrip without damage. Their engines remained clean and efficient despite the dusty conditions, and maintenance teams could perform essential repairs and servicing in a fraction of the time normally required. More importantly, the tactical advantages were revolutionary. Having close air support operating from forward positions meant that Allied ground forces could call for airstrikes with response times measured in minutes rather than hours. This capability proved decisive in several key battles as Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead and began their advance across France. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, personally witnessed the effectiveness of the forward deployed aircraft during a crucial battle near Saint-Lô. When his forces encountered strong German resistance, air support arrived within 8 minutes of the requesta, response time that would have been impossible with aircraft operating from distant bases. "This changes everything," Bradley radioed. "Back to headquarters, we're not just getting air support. We're getting integrated air-ground operations that give us capabilities the Germans can't match. Whoever developed these modifications has given us a decisive tactical advantage." The success of the forward deployment concept led to rapid expansion of the program. Within weeks, modified aircraft were operating from dozens of improvised airfields across France, providing unprecedented levels of close air support to advancing Allied forces. The German military, already struggling to adapt to sustained Allied air superiority, found themselves facing an entirely new form of warfare that their defensive doctrines couldn't counter. But perhaps most significantly, Maggie's innovations were demonstrating that individual creativity and technical expertise could have strategic implications in modern warfare. Her systematic approach to problem-solving, willingness to challenge conventional approaches, and ability to develop practical solutions under extreme pressure were changing how military leaders thought about technical innovation. By the end of June 1944, aircraft modified according to Maggie's specifications were operating across multiple theaters of war. Her techniques were being implemented in the Pacific, where modified aircraft were providing enhanced capabilities for island-hopping campaigns, and in the Mediterranean, where improved maintenance procedures were enabling sustained operations. In harsh desert conditions, the woman who had been dismissed as just a mechanic had become one of the most influential technical innovators of World War II, and her impact on the war effort was only beginning to be fully understood. By July 1944, Maggie O'Sullivan's name was being mentioned in classified reports at the highest levels of Allied command. Winston Churchill himself had been briefed about the extraordinary technical innovations emerging from RAF Biggin Hill, and there were discussions about awarding her recognition that had never before been given to a civilian maintenance worker. But for Maggie, the greatest reward was seeing her innovations save lives and contribute to Allied victories across Europe. Every successful mission flown by aircraft she had modified, every pilot who returned safely because of her repairs, and every tactical advantage gained through her forward deployment concepts reinforced her belief that technical excellence could make a decisive difference in warfare. The scope of her influence had expanded far beyond individual aircraft repairs. Military engineering schools were incorporating her problem-solving methodologies into their curricula. Aircraft manufacturers were studying her modifications to improve their production designs. And maintenance crews across the Allied forces were implementing procedures based on her systematic approach to diagnostics and repair. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of the O'Sullivan Protocol, a standardized approach to aircraft maintenance that emphasized comprehensive system analysis, innovative problem-solving, and proactive modification rather than reactive repair. This protocol was being implemented across British, American, Canadian, and Australian air forces, fundamentally changing how military aviation maintenance was conducted. The protocol included several key innovations that Maggie had pioneered. Systematic documentation of problems and solutions that could be shared across different bases. Standardized toolkits and procedures that could be adapted to multiple aircraft types. Emphasis on understanding root causes rather than just addressing symptoms. And encouragement of creative modifications that improve performance rather than simply restoring original specifications. But perhaps the most important aspect of the O'Sullivan Protocol was its recognition that individual expertise and innovation should be valued and encouraged within military hierarchies. Traditional military structures had often suppressed creative thinking in favor of following established procedures, but Maggie's success demonstrated that encouraging innovation could provide decisive advantages. This philosophical shift was having implications that extended beyond aircraft maintenance. Military leaders were beginning to recognize that the complexity of modern warfare required not just discipline and adherence to orders, but also creativity, adaptability, and technical innovation at all levels of the organization. Major Patricia Pat Williams, one of the first women to be assigned to aircraft maintenance following Maggie's success, wrote in her diary, "What Maggie has done goes beyond fixing airplanes. She's proven that competence matters more than convention, that innovation can be more valuable than tradition, and that individual excellence can change the course of history. She's opened doors for all of us." As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe throughout the summer and fall of 1944, the strategic advantages provided by Maggie's innovations became increasingly apparent. The sustained air superiority that her modifications enabled was allowing Allied ground forces to advance more rapidly than German forces could reposition their defenses. Intelligence reports indicated that German military leaders were struggling to understand how Allied air forces were maintaining such high operational efficiency. German technical experts had studied captured Allied aircraft and found modifications that they couldn't replicate with their available resources and manufacturing capabilities. General Adolf Galland, the German fighter commander, reportedly told his staff, "The Allies have achieved something that we thought was impossible. They have turned aircraft maintenance into a competitive advantage. Their planes are not just more numerous than ours. They are more reliable, more effective, and more adaptable to changing conditions." This technical superiority was having strategic implications that extended far beyond individual battles. The German Luftwaffe, already outnumbered and outproduced, was finding itself outmatched technically as well. German pilots reported that Allied aircraft seemed to perform better in combat than their specifications suggested they should, maintaining effectiveness under conditions that should have degraded their performance. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. When even superior German aircraft and experienced pilots couldn't gain tactical advantages, morale began to deteriorate throughout the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had once been confident in their technical superiority began to doubt their equipment and their chances of survival. Meanwhile, Allied pilot confidence was soaring. They knew that their aircraft had been personally inspected and modified by experts who understood both the technical requirements and the combat conditions they would face. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, better mission performance, and higher survival rates. Captain Rodriguez, whose P-51 had been one of Maggie's first major successes, wrote to his family, "I don't know how to explain it, but when Maggie works on your plane, you know it's going to bring you home. It's not just that the engine runs better, though it does. It's that you can feel the difference in how the whole aircraft responds. She doesn't just fix problems. She makes improvements that give you advantages in combat." By the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces approached Germany itself, the cumulative impact of Maggie's innovations was becoming historically significant. Air superiority that had been achieved through numerical advantage was being maintained through technical excellence. The sustained effectiveness of Allied air operations was enabling ground advances that were accelerating the timeline for ending the war in Europe. Maggie's most important contribution was still ahead of her. As winter approached and Allied forces prepared for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, her innovations would face their ultimate test under the most challenging conditions of the entire war. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. What would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and weather conditions were the worst that Allied air forces had faced during the entire war. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and persistent cloud cover were grounding aircraft across Europe just when air support was most desperately needed. German forces, led by experienced commanders who understood that their only hope of changing the war's trajectory was to exploit Allied vulnerabilities, had chosen this moment to launch their final major offensive. They knew that if they could neutralize Allied air superiority through weather conditions, their ground forces might achieve the breakthrough that could force a negotiated peace at RAF Biggin Hill, now serving as a coordination center for technical innovations across multiple air forces. Maggie faced the greatest challenge of her career. Standard aircraft simply couldn't operate effectively in the extreme weather conditions. Engines were freezing, control surfaces were becoming inoperable due to ice accumulation, and visibility was so poor that even experienced pilots couldn't conduct effective missions. The military situation was desperate. Allied ground forces were facing a major German offensive without the air support that had become essential to their tactical doctrine. Without reliable close air support, Allied ground commanders were fighting at a severe disadvantage, and initial German advances were succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections. Emergency meetings were held at the highest levels of Allied command. General Eisenhower himself arrived at Biggin Hill on December 20th to assess whether technical solutions could restore air operations despite the weather conditions. He found Maggie working around the clock with teams of engineers and mechanics, developing modifications that could enable aircraft operations in conditions that had previously been considered impossible. "Miss O'Sullivan," Eisenhower said, "I need to know if there's any way we can get our aircraft back in the air. The ground situation is becoming critical, and without air support, we could face a major reversal that might change the entire course of the war." Maggie's response was characteristically direct. "General, standard aircraft can't operate in these conditions, but modified aircraft might be able to. Give me 72 hours and access to every available resource, and I believe we can develop solutions that will restore limited air operations." What followed were the most intense 3 days of technical innovation in military aviation history. Maggie led teams working on multiple modifications simultaneously: engine heating systems that could prevent freezing, advanced de-icing equipment for control surfaces, improved visibility systems for pilots, and navigation aids that could function in zero visibility conditions. The engine heating systems required developing portable heating units that could be installed on aircraft and operated from ground power sources. These systems had to maintain optimal engine temperatures during ground operations while being lightweight enough not to affect flight performance. Maggie solved this by creating modular heating systems using components salvaged from vehicle heaters and aircraft electrical systems. The de-icing modifications were even more challenging. Existing de-icing systems weren't effective enough for the extreme conditions they were facing. Maggie developed enhanced systems that combined mechanical ice removal with chemical treatments and heated surfaces. The systems had to be reliable, effective, and implementable using available materials. Most critically, she developed navigation and visibility aids that could enable pilots to conduct effective missions despite the poor weather conditions. These systems combined radar modifications with improved cockpit lighting and simplified instrument layouts that could be operated even when pilots were wearing heavy cold weather gear. Working with minimal sleep and under extreme pressure, Maggie's teams modified over 40 aircraft in less than 72 hours. The modifications were tested under actual weather conditions, with volunteer pilots conducting flight trials that pushed both aircraft and crews to their limits. Flight Lieutenant Thompson, now promoted to squadron leader, conducted the first operational test flight on December 23rd. Despite weather conditions that would have grounded any standard aircraft, Thompson's modified Spitfire was able to conduct a successful reconnaissance mission over German positions, providing crucial intelligence about enemy movements and positions. "It's like flying a completely different aircraft," Thompson reported after landing. "The modifications don't just enable operations in these conditions, they actually provide advantages. The enhanced visibility systems give better situational awareness than we normally have in clear weather, and the improved navigation aids make precision flying possible even in zero visibility." The success of the initial test led to immediate deployment of modified aircraft in combat operations. Despite the continuing severe weather conditions, Allied air forces were able to provide limited but crucial close air support to ground forces fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. The tactical impact was immediate and decisive. German forces, who had planned their offensive around the assumption that weather would neutralize Allied air power, suddenly found themselves facing air attacks that they had believed impossible. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical advantages. German troops realized that even extreme weather conditions couldn't protect them from Allied air superiority. By December 26th, weather conditions began to improve, but Maggie's modifications had already proven their value. The limited air operations conducted during the worst weather had provided crucial support to Allied ground forces and had demonstrated that technical innovation could overcome even the most challenging environmental conditions. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately won by Allied ground forces, but the role of modified aircraft in providing support during critical periods was recognized as a decisive factor. Once again, Maggie O'Sullivan's innovations had changed the course of military history. As 1945 began, and the war in Europe entered its final phase, Maggie's contributions were finally receiving the recognition they deserved. But for the woman, who had been dismissed as just a mechanic, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her work had helped save lives and win the war against fascism. Her story had become a testament to the power of individual excellence, innovative thinking, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom in pursuit of better solutions. As 1945 dawned, the war in Europe was entering its final phase, but Maggie O'Sullivan's work was far from over. The success of her winter modifications during the Battle of the Bulge had established her as the foremost aircraft maintenance innovator in the Allied forces, and requests for her expertise were coming from every theater of the war. The Pacific Theater, where American forces were preparing for the final assault on Japan, presented entirely different challenges that would require new innovations. The tropical conditions of the Pacific created problems that were almost the opposite of those she had solved in the European winter. High humidity was causing electrical system failures. Saltwater corrosion was destroying metal components faster than they could be replaced, and the heat was creating engine cooling problems that standard systems couldn't handle. Additionally, the extended supply lines in the Pacific meant that aircraft had to operate with minimal maintenance support for much longer periods than European operations required. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, personally requested Maggie's assistance in solving these challenges. In February 1945, she was flown to Guam to assess the maintenance problems affecting B-29 superfortresses, the most advanced bombers in the American arsenal and crucial to the final campaign against Japan. What Maggie found in the Pacific shocked her. These state-of-the-art aircraft were experiencing failure rates that were unacceptably high due to the harsh environmental conditions. Engines were overheating during long missions over the Pacific. Electrical systems were failing due to humidity and salt corrosion, and the complex mechanical systems were breaking down at rates that threatened to undermine the entire strategic bombing campaign. The B-29s represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology, but they had been designed for operations in temperate climates with readily available maintenance support. The realities of Pacific operations, extreme heat, humidity, salt air, and extended missions were pushing these aircraft beyond their design limitations. Maggie approached the Pacific challenges with the same systematic methodology that had served her so well in Europe. She spent weeks studying operational reports, interviewing pilots and ground crews, and analyzing the specific failure patterns that were occurring. What she discovered was that the problems weren't random mechanical failures, but predictable results of environmental stresses that could be addressed through targeted modifications. Her solutions for the Pacific theater were as innovative as her European work had been. For the engine cooling problems, she developed improved air intake systems that maximized airflow while filtering out salt and moisture. These systems used principles of aerodynamic design combined with materials that could withstand the corrosive Pacific environment. The electrical system problems required even more creative solutions. Maggie developed comprehensive weatherproofing techniques that protected sensitive electrical components without interfering with their operation. She created sealed connection systems, improved insulation methods, and corrosion-resistant materials that extended the operational life of electrical systems in the harsh Pacific environment. Most significantly, she developed maintenance procedures that could be performed effectively under field conditions with limited resources. These procedures allowed ground crews to conduct essential maintenance and repairs using materials and tools that were readily available in the Pacific, reducing dependence on complex supply chains from the mainland United States. The impact of these modifications was immediate and dramatic. B-29 operational availability increased by over 35%. Mission abort rates due to mechanical failures dropped to historic lows, and the reliability of the strategic bombing campaign improved significantly. The enhanced performance of the B-29 fleet was contributing directly to the intensification of the bombing campaign that was devastating Japanese industrial capacity. But Maggie's most important contribution to Pacific operations came through her development of long-range maintenance procedures. The vast distances involved in Pacific operations meant that aircraft often had to operate for extended periods without access to major maintenance facilities. Traditional maintenance approaches simply couldn't support sustained operations under these conditions. Maggie solved this problem by creating modular maintenance systems that could be transported to forward bases and assembled quickly to provide comprehensive repair capabilities. These systems included portable workshops, standardized tool sets, and repair procedures that could be implemented by relatively small maintenance teams. The success of these modular maintenance systems enabled American forces to establish and maintain air operations from remote Pacific islands that had previously been considered unsuitable for sustained air operations. This capability proved crucial in the final phases of the Pacific War, as American forces were able to establish air bases closer to Japan and conduct more effective bombing campaigns. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the Enola Gay on the mission to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, worked with Maggie during the preparation of the B-29s for their most critical missions. Years later, he would write, "Maggie O'Sullivan understood that winning the war wasn't just about having the best aircraft. It was about making sure those aircraft could perform their missions reliably under the most challenging conditions imaginable." Her work made the difference between having advanced aircraft and having effective aircraft. As spring 1945 arrived, both European and Pacific operations were benefiting from innovations that had originated in Maggie's workshop at RAF Biggin Hill. The systematic approach to problem solving that she had pioneered was being implemented across the entire Allied air forces, and the cumulative impact was contributing significantly to the acceleration of victory in both theaters. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. While many factors contributed to Allied victory, the sustained air superiority that Maggie's innovations had helped maintain was universally recognized as one of the decisive elements. The technical advantages that her modifications provided had enabled Allied air forces to maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that would have severely degraded the performance of unmodified aircraft. But even as victory in Europe was being celebrated, the war in the Pacific continued, and Maggie's innovations would play a crucial role in the final chapter of World War II. The reliability and effectiveness of the modified B-29s would prove essential in the missions that would ultimately end the war and reshape the world. August 1945. The world stood on the brink of a new era, and the aircraft that would deliver the weapons to end World War II had been prepared by the hands of a woman who had once been dismissed as just a mechanic. The B-29s that would carry the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki incorporated numerous modifications that Maggie O'Sullivan had developed during her work in the Pacific Theater. Colonel Tibbets personally requested that Maggie inspect the Enola Gay before its historic mission. As she conducted her final checks on the aircraft's engines, electrical systems, and navigation equipment, she had no idea that this particular B-29 would change the course of human history. Her focus was simply on ensuring that every system would function flawlessly during what she knew was an extremely important mission. The success of the atomic bomb missions, tragic as their necessity was, marked not just the end of World War II, but also the validation of Maggie's approach to aircraft maintenance and modification. The reliability of the aircraft that delivered these war-ending weapons was due in large part to innovations that had been developed by a woman working in a maintenance hangar who refused to accept that good enough was sufficient when lives were at stake. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and World War II was officially over. As celebrations erupted around the world, military leaders began the complex process of assessing the factors that had contributed to Allied victory. Among the thousands of after-action reports and strategic analyses, Maggie O'Sullivan's contributions were consistently cited as having had strategic impact far beyond what anyone could have anticipated when she first arrived at RAF Biggin Hill. The final tally of her contributions was staggering. Aircraft incorporating her modifications had flown over 50,000 combat missions with reliability rates that exceeded peacetime standards. Her diagnostic and repair techniques had been implemented across Allied air forces, reducing maintenance time by an average of 40% and increasing aircraft availability by 35%. Most importantly, pilots flying aircraft that had been worked on by Maggie or her trained teams had survival rates that were measurably higher than those flying unmodified aircraft. But perhaps the most significant impact of Maggie's work was the fundamental change it had brought to how military organizations thought about technical innovation and individual expertise. The success of her unconventional approaches had demonstrated that encouraging creative problem-solving and individual initiative could provide decisive advantages in modern warfare. The lessons learned from Maggie's success were being incorporated into military doctrine for the post-war era. Military aviation schools were establishing programs based on her problem-solving methodologies. Engineering curricula were being modified to emphasize creative thinking alongside technical knowledge. And most importantly, military organizations were beginning to recognize that diversity of thought and experience could be a strategic advantage. Major General Spots, reflecting on the war's end, wrote in his official report, "Among the many factors that contributed to our victory, few were as unexpected or as significant as the innovations developed by Miss Margaret O'Sullivan." Her work demonstrated that individual excellence, when properly supported and encouraged, can have strategic implications that extend far beyond the immediate technical problems being addressed. The recognition that Maggie received as the war ended was unprecedented for a civilian maintenance worker. She was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Harry Truman, the Distinguished Flying Cross by the Royal Air Force, and numerous other honors from Allied nations. But more importantly, she had opened doors for women in technical fields that had previously been closed, and her success was inspiring a new generation of women to pursue careers in engineering and aviation. Bob Crothers, the senior mechanic, who had once been Maggie's most vocal critic, approached her during the victory celebrations at RAF Biggin Hill with characteristic honesty. He said, "Maggie, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, wrong about what women could contribute, and wrong about the value of innovation over tradition. You've taught all of us that competence matters more than convention, and that good ideas can come from anywhere. I'm proud to have worked alongside you." As military forces began the transition to peacetime operations, there was widespread recognition that the technical innovations developed during the war, particularly those pioneered by Maggie, would have applications far beyond military aviation. Aircraft manufacturers were studying her modifications to improve their civilian designs. Airlines were implementing her maintenance procedures to improve the reliability of commercial operations. And engineering schools were incorporating her problem-solving methodologies into their standard curricula. The woman who had grown up fixing farm equipment in rural Ireland had become one of the most influential technical innovators of the 20th century. Her systematic approach to problem-solving, her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and her ability to develop practical solutions under extreme pressure had changed not just how aircraft were maintained, but how complex technical problems were approached across multiple industries. But for Maggie herself, the greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from pilots whose lives had been saved by her work. Captain Rodriguez wrote, "I flew 127 combat missions in aircraft that you had worked on, and I came home to my family because of your dedication to excellence. Every bolt you tightened, every system you improved, and every innovation you developed was an investment in our survival. I owe my life to your refusal to accept good enough when perfection was possible." Flight Lieutenant Thompson, now promoted to Wing Commander, summed up Maggie's impact in his final combat report. "Miss O'Sullivan proved that individual excellence can change the course of history. She took aircraft that were good and made them exceptional. She took maintenance procedures that were adequate and made them revolutionary. Most importantly, she took an organization that was resistant to change and proved that innovation and tradition could work together to achieve victory." In the years following World War II, Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan's influence continued to grow far beyond the military aviation world, where she had first made her mark. The systematic problem-solving methodology she had developed, the innovative maintenance procedures she had pioneered, and the leadership principles she had demonstrated became foundational elements of post-war technological development. Aerospace industry that emerged in the 1950s was built on principles that Maggie had established during the war. Her emphasis on comprehensive system analysis, proactive modification rather than reactive repair, and the integration of field experience with theoretical knowledge became standard practices in aircraft design and manufacturing. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas actively recruited engineers and technicians who had been trained in her methodologies. But Maggie's post-war career took an unexpected direction. Rather than joining a major aerospace company, she chose to establish the O'Sullivan Institute for Technical Innovation, a research and training center dedicated to developing problem-solving methodologies that could be applied across multiple industries. The institute became a pioneering center for what would later be called systems engineering, bringing together experts from diverse fields to tackle complex technical challenges. The Korean War, in the early 1950s, provided the first major test of whether Maggie's innovations could be successfully transferred to a new generation of military personnel. The jet aircraft being used in Korea presented entirely different challenges from the propeller-driven aircraft of World War II, but the fundamental problem-solving approaches that Maggie had developed proved remarkably adaptable. Young maintenance officers who had been trained in her methodologies were successfully applying her diagnostic techniques to jet engines. Her systematic approaches to troubleshooting complex electronic systems, and her innovative modification procedures to improve aircraft performance under combat conditions. The success of these applications validated the universal applicability of her technical philosophies. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Chief of Staff of the newly independent United States Air Force, commissioned a comprehensive study of Maggie's contributions to military aviation. The resulting report, classified for decades, but finally released in the 1980s, concluded that her innovations had shortened World War II by an estimated 6 months and saved thousands of Allied lives. More significantly, the report identified her systematic approach to technical problem-solving as one of the key factors that gave Allied forces decisive technological advantages during the war. The report recommended that her methodologies be incorporated permanently into military training programs, and that efforts be made to identify and develop similar innovative talents in future conflicts. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Maggie continued to influence technological development through her work at the O'Sullivan Institute. Her teams worked on projects ranging from early computer systems to space exploration technologies, always applying the same principles of systematic analysis, creative problem-solving, and practical innovation that had served so well during the war. When NASA was established in 1958, Maggie was among the first consultants recruited to help develop maintenance and reliability procedures for the space program. Her experience with operating complex technical systems under extreme conditions proved invaluable as American engineers worked to put humans in space and eventually on the moon. The lunar landing program presented challenges that were remarkably similar to those Maggie had faced during the war complex. Technical systems that had to operate flawlessly under conditions where failure could be catastrophic, with limited opportunities for repair or replacement. Her systematic approaches to reliability analysis and her innovative solutions for maintaining technical systems under extreme conditions became foundational elements of space program methodology. Neil Armstrong, the first human to walk on the moon, later wrote, "The reliability of the systems that took us to the moon and brought us home was built on principles that people like Maggie O'Sullivan had developed decades earlier." Her understanding that technical excellence requires not just following procedures, but constantly improving them, was essential to the success of the space program. As Maggie entered her later years, recognition of her contributions continued to grow. Engineering schools began offering courses specifically focused on the O'Sullivan methodology. Professional engineering societies established awards in her honor. And most importantly, a new generation of women entering technical fields found inspiration in her story of overcoming skepticism and discrimination through demonstrated excellence. In 1975, at the age of 57, Maggie was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Aviation Maintenance. Standing before an audience of aviation professionals from around the world, she reflected on her journey from a farm in rural Ireland to becoming one of the most influential technical innovators of the 20th century. "When I first arrived at RAF Biggin Hill," she said, "I was dismissed as just a mechanic, but I learned that there's no such thing as just a mechanic, just an engineer, or just anyone who takes pride in technical excellence. Every bolt matters, every connection counts, and every improvement can make the difference between success and failure, between life and death." She continued, "The most important lesson I learned during the war wasn't about aircraft engines or electrical systems. It was about the power of individual excellence to change the world. When we refuse to accept good enough, when we constantly seek better solutions, and when we have the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, we can achieve things that others believe are impossible." Margaret O'Sullivan passed away in 1994 at the age of 76, but her influence continues to this day. The O'Sullivan Institute remains a leading center for technical innovation. Her problem-solving methodologies are still taught in engineering schools around the world, and her story continues to inspire new generations of technical professionals. The woman who was once called just a mechanic had proven that individual excellence, innovative thinking, and unwavering dedication to technical perfection could indeed change the course of history. In the end, she had fixed far more than aircraft. She had helped fix the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.